Good afternoon. My name is James Valentine, and welcome to the Adjunct Scientific Workshop on Autosomal Recessive Polycystic Kidney Disease, which is a direct follow-up to last August's externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. I'm joined in the studio by my co-host, Matt Becka, the Chief Research Officer at the PKD Foundation, and we're coming to you live from the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, actually not too far from where the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's headquarters are located. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Matt, who will be providing some opening remarks. Matt?
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the Adjunct Scientific Meeting on Autosomal Recessive Polycystic Kidney Disease, or ARPKD. Today, we'll be discussing more about integrating the patient and caregiver perspective into ARPKD therapy development. My name is Matt Becka, and I'm the Chief Research Officer at the Polycystic Kidney Disease Foundation. Our mission is to fund research, advocate for patients, and ultimately to end PKD. On August 28, 2023, the PKD Foundation hosted an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. During that meeting, those affected by ARPKD and their family members shared their experiences with the FDA, clinicians, researchers, industry partners, and other members of the patient community to help us understand the burden of disease and the need for treatments. This is especially vital for the ARPKD community as there are no available disease-specific therapies. We are grateful to the participants of the ARPKD EL-PFDD meeting for highlighting these important conversations and providing the patient voice to help inform clinical trial design and the development of therapies targeting the outcomes that matter the most to them. This adjunct scientific meeting today is a critical follow-up to give ARPKD clinical and research experts an opportunity to reflect on what was shared, as well as to identify important scientific priorities and data needed to move the field forward. To start the program, Larry Bauer will give a short recap of what we learned from the August meeting. Then, James Valentine will provide a general framework for integrating the patient voice into drug development. Afterwards, we'll hear from key opinion leaders and expert physician scientists. Dr. Lisa Guay-Woodford will discuss opportunities to conduct clinical trials in ARPKD, and Dr. Katherine Dell will share a landscape analysis of tools to evaluate what's important to ARPKD patients. After each, we'll hold a discussion with top experts to reflect on the challenges and opportunities we'll use to inform the next steps. I want to express our appreciation to the researchers working in labs and clinics around the world, striving towards a better understanding of basic and translational ARPKD science, and moving us closer to future clinical trials and therapies. We hope this meeting will encourage future research and successful new therapy development for people living with ARPKD who urgently need treatment options. To everyone watching online today, thank you. Please submit written questions for discussion through the form located just below the live stream player. We may have an opportunity during the discussion sessions to answer your questions, so please fill out the form below the player, submit, and be a part of today's conversation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Larry Bauer, a regulatory expert, former NIH researcher, and former FDA rare disease regulatory scientist who will provide a recap of the August meeting. Larry?
Thank you so much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Just an overview of what I'll cover. I'll review the meeting agenda for the EL-PFDD meeting. I'll talk about the clinical overview that was presented, as well as top symptoms and health effects, then move on to top unmet medical needs and talk about additional symptoms that were identified, and then people's preference for treatment approaches. So as Matt mentioned, the meeting took place on August 29th from 10 to 3. It was opened by Susan Bushnell, who's the president and CEO of the PKD Foundation. Then we had a representative from the FDA, Dr. Kratita Mistry, to give some opening remarks from the FDA perspective. Dr. Erum Hartung, who you'll hear from later, gave a clinical overview of PKD. And then we moved into the next part of the meeting where we heard from patients and caregivers. The morning session focused on health effects and daily impacts. We had 5 pre-recorded panelists. We also did some online polling. We had a moderated audience discussion as well as some Zoom discussion starters. In the afternoon, we shifted gears. We had an overview of the treatment landscape from Dr. Max Liebau, who you'll also hear from later. This was followed by patient and caregiver perspectives on current and future ARPKD treatments. What the format was the same, with some recorded panelists, polling, an audience discussion, and Zoom discussion starters. Then we had a summary of the meeting, and the meeting was closed by Susan Bushnell. So just a few highlights from Dr. Hartung's clinical overview. ARPKD is a rare disease. It affects approximately 1,500 children and young adults in the U.S. It can be diagnosed prenatally or later in life, and the severity of kidney and liver involvement varies widely with many different gene mutations. Some of the symptoms include enlarged kidneys with cysts, feeding difficulties, underdeveloped lungs, high blood pressure, risk of UTI, and hyponatremia. Congenital hepatic fibrosis includes dilated bile ducts, liver fibrosis, portal hypertension, enlarged spleen, and esophageal varices. This is a progressive chronic condition and has about a 15 to 30% mortality rate in infants that are diagnosed perinatally. So I'm going to go over some of the top symptoms and health effects in the morning session that the patients identified. First and foremost was kidney failure. This was one of the most burdensome symptoms that seemed to affect all patients. We heard from Eric, who was born with massive kidneys, which barely functioned. His parents said his kidneys continued to grow, causing him incredible discomfort. They continued to fail, so both had to be removed. It was the first of several major surgeries leading to successful kidney transplant at age of 13 months. We heard from Michelle, who has 2 sons. Our oldest didn't have any decline in kidney function until he was 16 years old, but now we've seen a bigger decline. From 16 to 23, his kidney function had gone down a fair amount, and he's hovering around 60% now. We heard from Colleen, who said since ARPKD begins early in fetal development, her son had significant kidney and liver involvement at birth. He experienced acute renal failure, and on his 23rd birthday began hemodialysis. 11 months later, he was offered a kidney and liver transplant. Lindsay had a son, Stephen, that was discovered to have ARPKD during a prenatal ultrasound, showing enlarged and echogenic kidneys. The kidneys impaired his breathing, and he had a double nephrectomy at 6 days old and started peritoneal dialysis and didn't walk for a year. He had a transplant within a year, but struggles now at age 12 with anti-rejection meds, adrenal insufficiency with short stature, and ADHD. One of the other top symptoms was high blood pressure. This can start at birth and is challenging to monitor, especially in infants and children. We heard from parents of Eric. He developed life-threatening hypertension and electrolyte imbalances. It made our hearts ache not to be able to hold him at all for the first few days, and it made our hearts break that we could not alter the course of this brutal disease. Lindsay has a son with ARPKD. She says he had high blood pressure since he was born, so he's been on high blood pressure meds since he was about 4 months old, and they've had to titrate it up, and his blood pressure measurements are always high. And lastly, we heard from Joe, parent of a 6-year-old daughter. Sometimes the high blood pressure is what leads to the ARPKD diagnosis. When she was 4, we went in for a standard checkup, and the doctor saw her blood pressure and said something's not right. We followed it until we learned about her kidneys and what was going on. We had never experienced or heard of anything like that. Liver problems was the third most bothersome ARPKD health-related concern. Many patients experience both kidney and liver issues, with each condition impacting the other. Shauna is a 24-year-old living with ARPKD, says, I've always had a heavier involvement with my liver. Right now, I'm not at a place where I'm ready for transplant, but I've had the high blood pressure, portal hypertension, I've had esophageal varices, and a lot of that was resolved with a splenectomy, and I had a devascularization, so a lot of that was rerouted. We also heard from Mike, whose son, Beth and Mike, were the parents of a son who passed away at the age of 10. Unfortunately, the enlarged liver was not the only life-threatening concern. Eric also had esophageal varices that could bleed at any time. He had problems with his bile duct that could lead to cholangitis, which is a life-threatening infection, and he had blood clotting dysfunction and several other liver concerns. Amy has an 11-year-old daughter. She experiences liver symptoms on a weekly basis, enlarged spleen, decreased activity, worry of variceal bleed. That's always in the back of our head, so it really limits what we can do and where she's allowed to go. GI issues, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, poor appetite, often connected with the liver issues and absorption difficulties. We heard about Kai, who vomited every night. He vomited every day. He'd smell something from across the room and vomit. He'd get hiccups and vomit, too many tickles and vomit. Something would make him cry and he'd vomit. On his second birthday, I remember doing some quick math to calculate he had vomited upwards of 7,000 times in his short life. Allie has a son with ARPKD, says in our son's first year of life, the hardest symptom was enlarged kidneys that limited our son to eat by mouth. This caused endless vomiting, lack of weight gain, and constant worry. And then Aaron, who has an 11-year-old son, when his kidney function really declined, he didn't want to eat anything. Food didn't really taste good to him. He just wanted to eat carbs. Additional issues identified were growth failure and small stature, urinary tract infections, shortness of breath, breathing problems, eczema, chronic itching, frequent illnesses and infections, and unfortunately, premature death. So in the polling that we did, the online polling, as you just heard, the top 3 most burdensome symptoms identified were the kidney failure, high blood pressure, and liver problems, followed by GI issues, but also included things like fatigue and anxiety and depression. So in the afternoon, as I mentioned, we shifted gears, hearing from Dr. Liebau. He said that rare diseases, this is a rare disease which is hard to study and it's clinically variable. He discussed the risk factors for early dialysis dependency in ARPKD. A detailed knowledge of the disease course and the risk subgroups is essential. New treatments may need to independently target the lung, kidney, and liver disease aspects of ARPKD. And the PKD Outcomes Consortium is a collaborative effort to find clear regulatory pathway for potential new treatments. And there are 2 trials with tolvaptan to be launched to study its effect on kidney disease. So when we heard from the patients and caregivers about treatment approaches, they discussed kidney and liver transplant. They emphasized that these are not a cure, but trading one chronic condition for another. A transplant's not a cure, but as I said, in trading one condition for another, multiple transplants are likely needed, and you introduce the risks for rejection and cancer. We heard from Lindsay, who said since transplant, there have been many struggles, and those struggles ebb and flow each year. Her son, Stephen, is now 12 years old and just celebrated his 10-year kidney transplant anniversary. It's an incredible milestone, but he's also currently undergoing treatment for donor-specific antibody-mediated rejection. It's confusing and hard for a 12-year-old to understand why he needs to do this treatment and why this is happening to him. And we heard from Jordan, who has a 9-year-old son. Transplants are miraculous, but they have all their own issues. Transplant, your immune system is weaker. It puts you at all sorts of risks for other diseases like cancer. Oh boy. We heard about splenectomy. Can solve spleen problems, but does not help liver issues, can result in immune suppression problems and blood clotting issues. Supportive medications may include probiotics, vitamin K, renal vitamins, calcium, and nutritional support for those who are unable to absorb fat due to biliary disease. Shauna said I was more susceptible to bleeding because I had lower platelet counts due to the enlarged spleen. To help with this, my doctors put me on vitamin K to help with the clotting. Chris has a 3.5-year-old son. He's got a lot of vitamin deficiencies related to him not absorbing his fat-soluble vitamins. And we heard from Ashley, who has a 6-year-old daughter. My daughter was on sodium supplements as an infant, as well as Bicitra for hyponatremia and acidosis. 1 second here. Okay. Other treatment approaches included symptomatic medications, such as anti-anxiety medications, therapy and counseling, exercise moderation, therapy dogs for some people. We heard from Lisa, who said for her daughter, she's trained her dog to be her therapy dog, and I know this helps lower her blood pressure and calm her. And she doesn't take him to school, but she does take him to a lot of different places. And from Colleen, except for improvements in generalized care for prenatal, renal, and transplant treatment for this disease. Not much has changed since my son's birth. There are no specific treatments that are, one second, no specific treatments for her son. The other thing, we also, sorry the slide didn't show up, but we also are considering growth hormone. For about half of the participants said they used growth hormone. And dialysis, of course, is an option that some people have opted for. Some of the downsides of treatments that people talked about were side effects. Some of the medicines I have to take, a ton of side effects that affect the quality of life, including headaches, nausea, dizziness, and I've even fainted several times. Jennifer, as a 19-year-old son, said when he was 17, the doctor started him on a medication to help with portal hypertension, but nobody told him that this would affect him being able to push himself when running. His times got worse. It really affected him mentally until we finally asked the doctor, who confirmed that that was a problem. Lisa has 2 daughters, and she said the more blood pressure medicines you take, the worse your kidneys get because they're damaging your organs. It's kind of a trade-off to see, well, how is her heart doing? Is her heart okay now? Then we're going to stay at 4 before we add another one. To add one more medication, you have to weigh the risks from the benefits. Route of administration can be an issue. Ashley, who has the 6-year-old daughter, said she's on 3 blood pressure medicines. She's on your sodiol. She's on iron, all of these twice a day. It's not an uncommon thing for her to take her medications and then vomit them up later. So that's our biggest problem right now, is that the pain and the uncomfortable aspect of having such a large abdomen and how that impacts her with her medications. And Jana, she's 13, living with ARPKD. Taking 12 pills a day is hard to remember to do. And then I have to make sure I eat with them. And I still get sick to my stomach almost every single morning and night of my life. I know all of my medicines by name, and I'm very responsible and mature. As far as hopes for the treatment, most people said they hope that there are new treatments to prevent kidney disease progression. They also said that the second biggest hope was preventing liver disease progression. And the third on the top list of hopes for the future was delaying time to avoid dialysis or transplant. Other things were people wished that there was help with the fatigue. They'd like to see decreased spleen enlargement, to reduce other symptoms, and to increase immunity. We heard from Lisa, who's a mom to 13 and 9-year-old daughters. She said, my short-term wish would be more clinical trials. I know there's lots of people that are very willing to continue participating in studies if it's going to maybe not help our children, because we have to have a place where our research is showing us how to finally find that cure. We don't know what's helping and what's not. So a big thank you goes out to all of the people living with PKD, as well as their caregivers who participated in the meeting and shared their invaluable insights. The meeting could not have happened without you. And now I'll turn it over back to the studio, where we'll take what we learned at the meeting and take it the next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. So it's with that rich set of feedback from the ARPKD community that I now want to spend a few minutes with you setting the stage and give an overview of some of the ways that this type of patient experience data can inform drug development and review. So I'm going to walk through just a few slides here to orient us to this topic, again, on how some of the ways that we can integrate the patient voice into drug development. If we go to the next slide. So this kind of culture shift that originated originally out of the Food and Drug Administration, this notion of patient-focused drug development came in 2012. And when FDA was announcing this initiative, they recognized that patients who live with a disease have a direct stake in the outcome of FDA's decisions and are in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of the disease. And today, over a decade later, many of us might find this as, as a no-brainer. However, it's really been over the past decades where patients have stood up and had their voices heard, where we've learned time and time again just how valuable the patient voice can be. So let's talk about some of those specific opportunities where we can leverage the patient voice. So one is at the very end of drug development, which it comes at the time of an FDA approval decision. So when approving a new drug, the FDA has to make it determine that the benefits of that drug outweigh its risks. And this is a scientific determination. FDA reviewers use their scientific expertise to evaluate clinical trial and other data to understand what the benefits are, as well as what the risks are. And the type of data that we have from clinical trials is not always completely certain. In fact, it never is completely certain. And so FDA is also evaluating how much certainty there is in terms of how much we can be confident in what the benefits or the risks of a product are. And so this is where FDA is really leveraging its scientific expertise. However, when FDA is then deciding whether the benefits actually outweigh the risks, this is a judgment call, and it's an inherently subjective one. There's no formula to plug in the benefits and risks of a drug that's going to compute an answer of whether the benefits outweigh the risks. So FDA is being asked to do this more qualitative judgment. But the question then is, how does FDA calibrate its values on how much risk a patient population should tolerate, in exchange for a given set of benefits and how important those benefits may be to patients? And this not only includes just what risks patients are willing to tolerate and what benefits are important to them, but also the degree of uncertainty around those things that a patient community may be willing to accept. And so that's where the benefit-risk decision framework comes into place. And the patient voice really provides the context for making these benefit-risk decisions. And FDA recognizes this, and that's why it put in place a structured benefit-risk decision-making approach that leverages two very relevant categories of patient experience. First being the burdens of the disease and the impacts that the disease has on patients' daily lives. And the second are patients' perspectives on the adequacy of available therapies. And those two things might sound very familiar. That's exactly what Larry just summarized of what came out of the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. And that was by design. And so by helping set this context, it helps FDA understand what types of benefit matters most to patients. And this allows them to input that information into the first two rows of that structured benefit-risk framework, first on the analysis of the condition and second on unmet medical need, so that way this evidence is being generated from patient experience data that then allows them in the lower three rows to assess benefits and risks and ultimately at the very bottom do that value judgment and consider whether the benefits outweigh the risks. But the patient voice is not only helpful at the very end when assessing all of the data from clinical trials, it's helpful early on in drug development and can help inform the design of clinical trials, including helping inform the selection and development of clinical outcome assessments, or COAs, which are measures of how patients feel and function. These are things like where patients are either asked to do a performance measure in a clinic, something that a clinician is reporting, a patient reports themselves, or maybe even a caregiver would report. We're not talking here about ultimate survival or even surrogate biomarkers, but again, really things that capture how either patients are feeling or functioning. And these are important because these are the kinds of outcomes that are used in adequate and well-controlled studies to help support approvals. And so the patient voice can help inform that selection and development of these tools by helping us know what are the right concepts of interest to measure. Are we measuring things that even are important symptoms or functional capabilities or other outcomes that patients represent as being either most bothersome or burdensome or top treatment priorities. It also helps us understand where there's opportunities to measure those concepts in patients' daily life. When patients describe the variability, perhaps, day to day that a particular symptom has in their life, that may indicate that you don't want to measure that only one time every 6 months because you don't know if you're getting a patient on a good day versus a bad day. So that you may need to instead try to measure that as part of a daily diary on a daily basis over a period of time and take an average to better reflect what patients are really experiencing. And ultimately, in order to know what result on one of these measures would actually be considered meaningful to a patient, well, patients are the ones who are best positioned to help us understand what translates to something meaningful. And oftentimes we hear that small changes or slowing or stopping of progression even, not even improvements, result in clinically meaningful treatment benefits for people receiving drugs. Beyond clinical outcome assessments, I just want to mention a few other aspects of trial design where the patient voice is very helpful to inform. I want to mention here that it can help inform the quality of the clinical evidence that helps establish a drug's benefit under FDA's regulatory framework. Their standard for determining that a drug has sufficient evidence of effectiveness is called substantial evidence. And so this is informed not only by the robustness of the result, but also how the trial is designed and statistical considerations. So substantial evidence must be based on at least one adequate and well-controlled trial. And traditionally, FDA views randomized, double-blind, currently controlled trials as providing the greatest amount of certainty. But in certain circumstances, FDA also recognizes that alternative trial designs may be appropriate as well. And this is primarily when a disease is serious, or it has an unmet medical need, or it is a rare disease. And in ARPKD, we certainly would achieve or meet all three of these different characteristics of a disease that would warrant consideration of some of these non-traditional approaches. And in doing so, FDA recognizes that there's a somewhat greater risk of a false positive conclusion, meaning that there might be less certainty about the drug's effectiveness that comes out of one of these types of trial designs. And to note what some of those are, that could include things like a single-arm trial with an external or natural history control. That could include use of an unvalidated but reasonably likely surrogate biomarker or intermediate clinical endpoint in order to help support an accelerated approval. It may even allow for a somewhat higher p-value, something greater than p of 0.05 to be pre-specified if justified for powering. So I hope you'll keep these in mind as we go into our discussion and really reflect on the different things that we heard from the externally led PFDD meeting. If you'd like to learn more about FDA's current thinking on these topics of how the patient voice can be valuable to drug development and review, I've included a couple of links to resources from the FDA on this slide. So with that as background, let's get into our discussion today to begin to translate that patient voice from the externally led PFDD meeting. In our first topic for discussion today, we're going to explore what opportunities there are to conduct clinical trials in ARPKD. And to start this discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Guay-Woodford. Dr. Guay-Woodford is a Senior Advisor for Clinical and Translational Research Initiatives and Director of the Inherited Kidney Diseases Program at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She holds the Presidential Scholar Endowed Chair for Clinical and Translational Science and serves as Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks very much, James. So it's a pleasure for me to participate in this meeting today, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. What I was asked to do is to sort of think about the translational considerations. What will it take to translate our current knowledge and new knowledge into clinically meaningful trials for ARPKD? And so to do this, Just a brief background. I know the August meeting, Erum and Max did a great job of setting the stage for ARPKD, but just to remind you, the estimated incidence of this disorder is 1 in 26,500 live births. As I'll talk about in a minute, that actually comes from an analysis of the electronic health record and really is consistent with previous estimates that were largely based on genetic studies. To put this in perspective, this means that ARPKD is at least 10 times, maybe even more, less common than the dominant form of polycystic kidney disease. The renal disease is similar in that there are cysts, but the kinds of cysts are very different. Instead of the soap bubble cysts that sort of bud off the continuity of the nephron, as shown in the schema in the middle of the slide, there really is a dilatation of the nephron, particularly that last portion of the nephron called the collecting ducts, and it gives a very classic pathologic image that is shown in the right-hand side of the schema. ARPKD is, as we know, not just a kidney disease. The other major organ that's involved is the liver. But there's a very specific part of the liver that's involved, and that is the branching biliary tree in the liver and the associated portal venous structures around that. And that's shown as schematically in the bottom of the slide. And as a result of that, the bile ducts don't form normally, actually, and neither does the portal vascular tree. And that gives rise to a pattern that we recognize pathologically as congenital hepatic fibrosis. So there is an abnormality in this developmental pattern that starts kind of with the interplay between the developing vascular system, the portal venous system, and the epithelial system. And as a consequence of that, it sets up a set of processes that lead to scarring around these structures and sort of dysfunction of that portion of the liver, which is not the major portion of the liver. Quite frankly, it's only about 5% of the cellular mass of the liver. And so for many of these patients, while the liver disease can be substantial, as Erum discussed in August, many of these patients, the vast majority of these patients, don't go on to have end-stage liver disease. But nonetheless, medically complicated liver disease because of the scarring around the portal vein. In terms of the molecular genetics, this is a disease that's largely caused by defects in a single gene. There are a couple of other genes that affect, relatively speaking, a handful of patients, but the major gene is PKHD1. And that's important to consider because while ARPKD may be largely due to mutations in PKHD1, ARPKD has lots of mimics. In fact, there are children with defects in PKD1 that can present in the newborn period and for all the world look like ARPKD. Similarly, as this is indicated in the highlighted text with the bold red font, mutations in another gene, HNF1B, can, in some forms, mimic ARPKD. And then there are a large number of other genes that classically cause diseases that we clinically can recognize as distinct from ARPKD. But there are children that can overlap in terms of their clinical presentation. So for example, they may have a mutation in one of the nephronophthisis genes, one of the NPHP genes, but it can look clinically and in terms of imaging like ARPKD. So there is a level of genetic complexity that when we're thinking about clinical trials, we really need to take into consideration. The next question, we've all said that this is a rare disease. How rare is it? And so we conducted an analysis of one of the electronic health system and determined that in terms of the incidence, that is how many children are born with this disease, that the incidence in the United States is about 1 in 26,500 live births. And as I said, that corresponds to estimates that have come largely from genetic studies. We were able to drill into that population a little bit more precisely and determine that the perinatal mortality, which in some reviews is estimated to be as high as 50%, at least in this subset of patients in this electronic health record study, it was closer to about 20%. And so what does that mean for how many patients in the United States are living with ARPKD between 0 and 29 years of age? And again, our analysis allowed us to make an estimate of about 1,500 patients. So this is a rare disease, but there are about 1,500 patients between 0 and 29 living with this disease. And so it's not an ultra-rare disorder that's only involving a handful of patients. And I think that that's important in terms of thinking about investments in clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also important, and I know Erum raised this point when in her discussion in August, as did Max, that these patients don't have a sort of single presentation. And the testimonies that Larry went through are really a marker of the variability of the disease. So although there are 1,500 patients living with ARPKD in the US, at least this is our best estimate, there is a wide degree of variability in terms of their kidney disease and their liver disease for who has significant complications from both and who has relatively mild disease in both their kidneys and their liver. Again, something to take into consideration as we're considering designing clinical trials. So, as of January 2024, this is the clinical trial landscape as captured by clinicaltrials.gov, which really does a very good job, is probably a very good source of truth of clinical trials across the world, because many of those trials recruit in the United States, and that's how they get this information. So right now, there are about 5 studies in the United States, and these are studies that are currently recruiting, these are studies that have closed recruitment, and these are studies that are on deck. And the same in Europe. Those studies fall into 3 major categories. There are the clinical trials with drugs. Max mentioned tolvaptan in the August discussion. Some of the members of this panel were involved in the tesofovir study that was recently completed. There are registries that are registered in clinicaltrials.gov, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there are diagnostic studies. There was a very important study that was conducted at the NIH about genetic and clinical features of ARPKD and related disorders that has concluded. And there is a new study in France looking at non-invasive strategies for prenatal diagnosis of ARPKD. But that's the sum total of the current activity. So how do we increase that activity? What's needed for clinical trials? And I know Katherine is going to spend some time talking about this, but to just sort of summarize it in a single slide, we need research-ready patient cohorts, and we need cohorts that represent the populations of the world. So we need international databases and international databases that are collecting more or less the same data on these patients so that we can understand how the disease expresses itself in populations across the world. We need pathobiologic insights. As I mentioned, there are numbers of disorders, including the dominant form of PKD, that shares a number of features with ARPKD. We can use those common insights. Tolvaptan is a product of those common insights in terms of its application to ARPKD. But then there are going to be specific ARPKD-specific pathways that need to be considered for being druggable targets in future clinical trials. And of course, how do we know any of these drugs are having an effect? And Katherine will spend some time talking about biomarkers of disease progression. And these could be clinical. Max has had some lovely reports on a clinical cohort and clinical biomarkers of disease progression. It could be biochemical, it can be genetic, and it can be imaging. And then finally, in thinking about therapeutics, there are pathways that drugs have been developed for other diseases, like tolvaptan, where the pathways involved in those other diseases are the same pathways that are involved in PKD. That's drug repurposing. And it is a faster way to go, if you will, in terms of applying a drug in a clinical trial. But then there are going to be novel insights, ARPKD-specific pathways for which we'll need to develop novel agents. So in terms of the databases, as I mentioned, there are a number of databases or registries. There is Max's really lovely and very powerful database centered in Cologne, Germany, recruiting patients from Europe and from Turkey that has a large number of patients and has had some very important reports giving us insights into the progression of this disease. There is our clinical database in the United States that is a loose consortium of about 20 participating centers, and to date has registered a little bit over 200 patients. And then there is the RADAR effort in the UK that has registered over 200 patients. And these numbers are numbers since 2023, so pretty up to date, but not as of January 24. It's to give you an idea about these databases. One of the things that is really important is that Max and I have made a real effort to do what's called harmonizing the database, these databases. So we are collecting the same core elements from the patients that we enroll. And that therefore allows these databases to be covering more than just their geographic distribution and really representing the way the disease expresses itself in different populations across the globe. So to summarize, there are a number of genetically distinct cystic diseases that can mimic or phenocopy ARPKD, and we need to take that into consideration as we're designing clinical trials. But while these cystic diseases are clinically distinct, there may be disease manifestations that are common, the so-called common pathways in PKD. And there has been a lot of work in terms of developing, particularly for ADPKD, druggable targets and drugs that are useful in those contexts that could be applied using the drug repurposing model in ARPKD. Colleen is right. At the current time, current therapy for ARPKD and these mimic disorders focuses largely on supportive management. But even here, optimizing supportive management so that these children have more readily controlled hypertension or blood pressure, that these children have less issues with vomiting and early satiety, that we can get these children to grow more effectively. Optimizing supportive management is also a worthwhile goal. By and large, the paucity of clinical trials is because clinical trial design for targeted therapeutics has been hampered by the lack of prognostic and predictive markers. How do we know these drugs are working? And Katherine will spend some time thoughtfully taking us up to date in terms of where the landscape is. And I think perhaps a really important take-home message, an empowering message for families, is research-ready cohorts enrolling these children in databases across or registries across the world is beginning to change the landscape for how we understand this disease, how we understand which cohorts of these children might be amenable to which therapies, and therefore how we can intelligently design clinical trials that have the optimal chance of being successful. And so I will stop there and turn it back to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for getting us started on this topic. And let's keep the momentum going as we now have our first opportunity to discuss a topic with our expert panelists today. For those of you who are following along and on live today, we invite you to contribute with some of your questions, and time permitting, we'll try to include those in the discussion. You can use the question box that's under the player on the webpage you're following along today. So I'd like to welcome our expert panel. In addition to Dr. Guay-Woodford, we're also joined by Dr. Katherine Dell from the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Erum Hartung from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Dr. Max Liebau from the University of Cologne. So without further ado, let's get into some of our questions here. On this first one, I'd like to just kind of go around and have each of you, just introduce yourself and give us some of your top line thinking. And this is really, reflecting on all of that feedback that we heard from the externally led PFDD meeting. Larry could only, bring a small slice of that into the conversation. I wonder what's maybe surprising or noteworthy to you about what you heard at that meeting, and any initial thoughts that you might have about how that might inform how we should be approaching research in this area. And so, Erum, maybe we can start with you first.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me was the prominence of GI symptoms and how really disabling they are, how frequent they are, and how that really affects people's quality of life. We're used to, in children with other kidney diseases, dealing with feeding issues and GI intolerance, but I think the degree and severity that some of the families reported was definitely striking in this group.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Max, how about you? Anything, as a kind of top line as we get started here, stood out as kind of striking from the PFDD input?
Yeah, I agree with Erin that the GI issues were striking, and they also surprised me. One of the maybe funny things to my US colleagues is that for me as a European, also, what families were telling about how they travel with these kids in the US, and again, showing me the distances that these families have to go through was very. Very. It left a strong impression on me. Yeah.
Sure. No, thank you for that. Katherine, as we're just going around here, what stood out?
Yeah. I think Erum and I actually discussed the GI side effects, which was also very striking to me because having taken care of these kids for many years and sort of had an awareness that it was kind of a problem, the prominence of it was really, really striking. So was and again, we know this on paper, but it's sort of hearing it from the patient, the spectrum of experience of the disease was also quite impactful.
Interesting. And Katherine, when you say spectrum of disease, is that related to kidney or liver function or certain symptoms?
All of the above. It was the frequency of symptoms, the type of symptoms, the experience of liver versus kidney, the ages. It was just the whole spectrum.
Absolutely. And Lisa, obviously you've reflected some on this, but anything else that comes to mind as really striking, was maybe you were surprised to hear or, uniquely impressed you from that meeting?
Yeah, I would sort of combine the things that I heard at that meeting, the things that I've read subsequently, with some of the experience around clinical trials, and I think in this regard, James's comments, your comments were really, really important in terms of the patient voice, because in my clinical practice, what I heard in the meeting is families are highly motivated to be involved in research. Mm-hmm. And then you come to discuss a specific clinical trial. And if you don't have their voices at the table at the get-go, they go, we were very interested. We really want to participate, but it's the long distance traveling with a 7-month-old who has a G tube, and you're only going to pay for one parent. And then we think, oh, gee, how did that happen? Or there is the issue of vomiting and, having to go travel long distance with a child who vomits multiple times a day. Or there's the issue of, it's taken us so long to get to this stable point. I'm really interested in research, but I don't want to upset the apple cart. Mm-hmm. And so all of these things make it important for us, I think, before we start to sit down with our pathway diagrams and the available drugs and the new biomarkers, is to really talk about what would a clinical trial in this disease, depending on the organ that's targeted, what would it require, and what can families who are highly motivated, but what can they tolerate?
Well, there's so much to unpack in what each of you just said. I'm now very excited to get to some of our other questions, because I think we'll be circling back, whether it's, on the GI involvement, the heterogeneity, some of the logistical and other barriers to participating in trials, and an otherwise, motivated, patient community. And so maybe, as we're in this first topic, thinking about opportunities to, or creating opportunities for clinical trials for individuals to, participate. I certainly myself also heard loud and clear that patients and the caregivers of the pediatric patients, do have that tremendous desire to participate. So I want to dive a little deeper on this idea of where do you see there, being any restrictions, whether it's based on study design or some of these practical considerations, or maybe even things within the study protocol, like study procedures, that would make a study more or less acceptable to what we heard is a really broad and heterogeneous population. So Max, maybe we'll ask you to chime in first on this question.
Right. So some of the obstacles have been mentioned, traveling, etc. I think at the end of the day, there's always this issue of finding the right balance between security from a clinical trials point of view. So obviously a company or someone setting up a clinical trial wants to be sure that they would notice if there's any issue coming up. So from their point of view, it's very important to see patients frequently and to have controls of blood values, etc. But then it's been mentioned the issue of tolerability. How much how much burden can a family take? I mentioned that the distances that depending on in which country you live and which center takes part in such a clinical trial can be huge issues. And then there may be other regulatory issues, thinking about global trials for these rare diseases. There may be differences between US regulations and European regulations, etc. So these are some of the obstacles I see.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, Max, about what one of the things you pointed out is the kind of need for some amount of central sites, and how that can impact, for example, the amount of distance someone has to travel. Are there opportunities that you see, given the types of assessments that need to be done in these clinical trials to, kind of try to help address, some of that travel, burden to these central sites?
Hard for me to say for the US because I've never sort of developed a clinical trial within the US, so I'd be careful to comment on this, especially as there are other experts obviously here. I guess what we in Europe what we've managed to arrange is that there's a very close and dense network of centers that over many years by now have collaborated for various clinical trials. So there is a growing experience on the number of patients you would expect in such a trial, etc. So here there are surely new opportunities just throughout or through the networking that has been developed.
Sure. Katherine, please jump in. I saw you raise your hand there.
Yeah. So in my current role, I oversee over 100 trials in all the different pediatric specialties. And I wanted to comment on this issue of balancing safety with kind of the tolerability to the patient. And I've been really struck by the fact that obviously safety is incredibly important, but I have seen clinical trials crash and burn in multiple specialties where, they targeted enrollment. These are small trials of, say, 40 patients, and at the end of 5 years, they had 7. And that is time and money, and that's not what definitely the pharmaceutical companies want to hear. But part of it is such stringent inclusion-exclusion criteria to the point where you design yourself out of the trial. And this is, I think, where this idea of bringing the families in early and assessing that tolerance of risk, not just on paper, but like how much does it really mean to them, is an incredibly important thing. The other thing from a purely practical standpoint is I think we learned a lot during the COVID shutdown. We learned a lot about pivoting to having drugs developed, drugs delivered, and this is US I'm speaking for, drugs delivered to patients by, the mailing things to them, by having, the home nurses do procedures so that the patient isn't driving 3 hours to get a blood draw, or having labs, contracting with the lab locally so the family just goes to that local lab and the research results are sent to us. So I think we can be a lot more nimble about designing these trials to take away some of this burdensomeness to the families.
So I want to follow up on a couple of things you said, Katherine, one of which is, we'll maybe take the latter topic first, which is kind of decentralizing certain aspects of these trials. Are there, I guess, to what extent do you think, we can decentralize trials? Are there, are we talking about decentralizing some of the actual, nephrology assessments that are occurring, or what do you think needs to be done in the central site versus what can be delegated out to maybe these more home or local either nephrology clinics or directly to patients' homes maybe even?
So I would say the three things that could potentially fairly readily be outsourced, so to speak. And that's assuming all the various legal agreements, et cetera. But one is labs, lab draws. We already do this with like our transplant patients who live 3 hours away. They get their labs drawn locally. They mail them to us. There's a very nice system. So lab draws. Medication accounting. So as you may know, when you are in a study, one of the important things the study visit does is it takes back your medication. It says how many tablets or how much liquid did you take, et cetera. That could be done as a virtual visit. Delivering the next supply of med to the family rather than having them come to the site to get the drug supply. Is that 3? And I think those are very easy, the proverbial low-hanging fruit. I think the nephrology assessments like blood pressure and stuff is a little more challenging, only because things like getting accurate blood pressure to a 2-year-old is a skill set we've all worked on for the last however many years of our career. And so I wouldn't necessarily put that out there, but the other stuff should be.
Sure. Erum or Lisa, either of you have thoughts on this idea of, how do we make clinical trials more accessible to those patients who do want to participate?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to pick up on something that both Katherine and Lisa had touched on, which is that risk-benefit analysis, because I think we're so used to thinking as doctors when we talk about risk in terms of like medical risk. But if you think about what being in a trial entails for a family, aside from the travel, as other people raised, there's a trial right now where they're asking people to do a 24-hour urine collection. Can you imagine trying to get your 12-year-old to do daily 24-hour urine collections while they're trying to go to school or do their sports or live their lives? And even just from hearing at the meeting in August, the way in which ARPKD really has so many effects on children's day-to-day lives, just the disease itself, like, whether they can go for a sleepover, whether they can ride their bike, all of these things. And then to ask people who are already so burdened to do very burdensome procedures that are done in the name of safety, but maybe sometimes are a little overkill, perhaps. So I think we have to be very careful about the types of tests that we ask people to do, because even if each individual test isn't risky per se, it's that added burden of one more procedure, more and more hours away from home and away from their lives.
And in your experience with clinical trials, is this the kind of thing that, is it, families are seeing this and they're not enrolling, or are they enrolling and then only really once they're in the study do they realize the burden of this, and are they dropping out or missing these collections? Just kind of practically, what does that translate to?
I think, because the informed consent process is so rigorous, all of these things are disclosed up front when families are informed about trials. And so, I'm not involved with the right now with that trial that I mentioned with the 24-hour urine collections, but I was involved with another one before. And, the informed consent form spells out in the table all of the procedures you're going to have to do, and you're coming for 2 full days. And, this is the giant list of things you have to do. And people look at that and they're like, no way. There's no way I can do this. And so I think we really have to be very careful about how we design these things, even in terms of kind of staggering things, doing things locally, as Katherine said, maybe being able to leverage local resources like pediatricians or local hospitals to do some of the things that are not critical to be done at the main site if it's not a very specialized test. So I think we really have to think about some of these practical things.
Yeah, thank you. And Lisa, I see you came off mute as well, so I would love to hear what you have to add.
I would just offer 2 thoughts, one complementary to what my colleagues have said, and another maybe taking us in a little bit different direction. So the complementary comments is in the adult world. People are involved in clinical trials, and increasingly they don't come to the mothership. COVID pushed that even further, but there's a whole sort of cadre of clinical research organizations that use research nurses, that use other healthcare professionals to go to people's homes. And that takes a lot of the day-to-day burden of having to travel. Just even, I was in Washington for a long time. I'm relatively new here to Philadelphia. It's a Northeast city. There's a lot of traffic. That can add a stressful component to people who are already living stressful lives. So I think, there are now increasing efforts to have sample collection from children. The current, sort of floor is about 12 years old, but that can be pushed, further with time, and we should avail ourselves of that. Catherine's point about mailing medications and thinking about, health professionals going to people's home. I think people would like to participate, but, they can't upset their whole family, particularly if there are other children involved who have other demands of childhood, like playing a sport or participating in a theater group. So we really have to be thinking about how can we make this manageable, safe, but manageable. Right. And then the different direction, we talk about, and, Matt and others at the PKD Foundation, which, I've been involved with the foundation for 30 years, is very near and dear to my heart, and their message is so important, the one of hope. And cure is ultimately what we want for single gene disorders. And we're beginning to see that with disorders like sickle cell disease, or really mitigation of the full consequences of disease like we see in cystic fibrosis. But between here and cure, what I would really like us as a community to think about is some of these incredible morbidities. And since August, I've been thinking about, we don't have a clinical trial about hypertension, a worldwide clinical trial about hypertension management in children with ARPKD. Now, there are all kinds of logistic issues that we don't necessarily need to get into here, but it's a big problem. And we know hypertension by itself affects the cognition of children. So it's not just taking all these medications, it's their performance and things. Right. And so that's an important issue. The vomiting GI issue, thinking about in other disorders like cystinosis, where vomiting is a big problem, there are efforts to try to think about how can we target that as a morbidity of the disease to improve the quality of life. So I think while we're on this relentless journey towards a cure, we have to think about near-term wins and maybe more effective management of the complications of this disease, hypertension and some of the GI issues would be logical places to start the conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm going to make sure I'm filing away that when we have our second panel discussion a little later, that we make sure we revisit whether we have the right tools to and capabilities to assess those types of symptoms that clearly were at the top of patients and caregivers' minds at the PFDD meeting, and clearly, as you're saying now, Lisa, warrant addressing with treatment approaches. I want to kind of build on some of the discussion we've been having. I've heard a couple of comments in some of our questions here about the vast heterogeneity that really stood out to you all, in terms of the patient experience across basically every facet of ARPKD. And then I've also heard in this discussion that we just had, about the difficulties of getting people to be able to even enroll or qualify for clinical trials. And so I wonder, as you're thinking about, the scope of the defined population for a clinical trial, or maybe put differently, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, is there anything that we should be considering or taking away from, what we've learned from the patient community that we view as maybe being able to offer this opportunity for clinical trials to a wider range of people with ARPKD? So, Katherine, maybe I'll pick on you this time to get us started.
Yeah, I think one of the big issues that needs to be thought through really carefully is that a lot of drugs are metabolized by the liver. A lot of drugs are metabolized by the kidney. You have a disease that has kidney and liver disease. And while your target may be the kidney disease or the liver disease, one of the challenges is that not infrequently, a disease, a drug that, say, targeted the liver disease might have as an exclusion a certain level of kidney function. And if you're below that, you can't be in the trial because we know it affects how your body handles it. Or the flip side is a drug for kidney disease maybe has liver side effects. So of course the exclusion is all these liver things. And so I think there just needs to be a lot of thought placed in terms of, there are standard ways that people assess kidney liver disease and various things. And I think specific to this disease, just need to be very cognizant of having too many exclusions that will essentially kick out a large proportion of kids in this rare disease. So that's the one comment I have about that.
Yeah, it was very striking to me during the meeting, the PFDD meeting. You hear, for some it's primarily one or primarily the other, but for most, at least it seemed to me that there was involvement to some degree in both. And so, it doesn't seem like it makes sense to just, almost treat it as two completely different diseases. You're leaving out everyone in the middle. So, I'd love either any reflections from our other panelists on that or other elements of defining the patient population, that might come to mind with you. Lisa?
I think that this was the motivation for a number of us to be thinking about these patient registries or these patient databases. So, we talk about the variability, but can we organize the variability into subgroups of patients with ARPKD? And I think that's a really important challenge that Max's group is just hats off. They've done such a fantastic job. And the rest of the world, like us in the United States and Canada and Australia and other places, need to catch up. But to really be thinking about what are the key subgroups of ARPKD, and in those subgroups, what are the principal challenges that clinical trials should target? So the cohort of children who have really rapidly progressive kidney failure, that's one group. The kids that are diagnosed at 6 because they had an incidental finding on an ultrasound, and we heard from those patients' families, that they shouldn't be in the same group. But how do we more precisely understand these subgroups? And then how do we take the conversation about clinical trials and clinical interventions and match them up with the major issues for those groups?
Well, Max, since Lisa called out some of the work that you're doing, maybe I'll ask that you chime in here too.
Right. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think there is, and not that we did good work. I mean, thank you, but that's not what I wanted to say. But I couldn't agree more that we need to sort of understand what the subgroups are and what the main issues for these subgroups of patients with ARPKD and the families are. I fully agree that most of the patients, almost all of the patients, will have some part of kidney and liver disease. But still, we've also heard during the meeting that for some of the families, kidney disease in the first year of life was like the one main issue, whereas I think there were other patients, and we see it in our clinics, that may have less of a kidney disease issue, but then during adolescence or young adulthood develop more of a liver problem. And clearly, for a clinical trial, even with small numbers, as it is such a rare disease, it's, I think, an important step would be to sort of define the subgroups and just to make sure that you have the right patients to compare to, so the right control groups, and clearly, the kid in the first year of life is different from the 16-year-old.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of great ideas about, can we better define subgroups, that might also in tandem allow us to almost identify, the key features or issues that those groups are facing. But I also, as we're thinking about an already very rare population, we're talking then about very small, potentially pretty small subsets within that. In order to, enable, clinical trials that are going to be of an adequate size to interpret and draw, conclusions from, are there any solutions that you all might have in terms of, how can we basket these subgroups together, even if we, maybe each one has, its own, different or maybe unique features or slightly different treatment goals. How do we then, at the same time, not, back ourselves into a corner where we're, saying, our hypothesis is, to see if we have this very specific treatment goal in this very specific subpopulation. So would love your reflections, on, how do we, take advantage of this idea of coming up with these subgroups while at the same time, having adequately sized clinical trials. Lisa, since you're the one off mute, I'll pick on you to start us off here.
So I would propose that we think about it as sort of a math problem. So we've done the first part of the math problem. We've identified, and these are not perfect numbers, but it gives us a real world sense of how many patients there are, for example, in the United States, say 1,500. But I think that what we don't really know, and Max's data begins to get at this a little bit, is really when do these patients come to medical attention? I think all of us as clinicians think that it's early in life. Mm-hmm. And so those are going to be the patients who very often have the sort of the most pressing disease consequences. Mm-hmm. As time goes on, their kidney function declines, their liver becomes an issue, their very distended bellies become an issue for all the GI issues that we thought about. So I think that defining, sort of with these subgroups, not just their clinical presentation, their phenotype, but when were they diagnosed? And can we identify kids that maybe are progressing really very slowly? For those kids, we should think about studies that are going to optimize the management of their symptomatic disease. Perhaps lead with that. For the kids that have the very sort of florid, on fire course, that are rapidly losing kidney function, the alarm bells are sounding. Those are the kids that we should be thinking about these, sort of targeted therapies that get at PKD specific pathways to slow the rate of progression of disease in the kidney and maybe even in the liver. So I think that's the first sort of order of things to think about, is not just who are these subgroups, but how does the cohort sort of shake out across this distribution. And I guess the final thing that I would say in this regard is that to a certain extent, my experience in this sort of domain is that it is difficult to prioritize, but is important for success, because success can beget success. And so if we do a good job really identifying a really well-designed clinical trial that has the optimal, sort of design features, inclusion criteria, really meaningful exclusion criteria, that has really good biomarkers, multiple biomarkers, so that we can really understand how we change progression of disease, that we can build on that study applied in one subgroup to subsequent subgroups. And so I guess the metaphor that I would use, if ARPKD is an elephant, we shouldn't try to swallow the whole elephant with a way we're going to design trials. Maybe let's start with the trunk.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy. We are just at about time for the first part of the discussion we had, and we've covered a lot of what I wanted to talk about, have us talk about based off of what we collectively heard from that PFDD meeting. Erum, I'll maybe give you any final word on this topic of heterogeneity and ensuring we have inclusion, exclusion, that welcomes those who are interested in trials into the fold.
Yeah, I think what I was thinking of was going back to Lisa's earlier point about kind of patient research-ready cohorts of patients. I think if we can build infrastructures and research networks where we can actually know who the patients are and where they are before we decide to launch trials, and target the locations of the trials and the trial procedures to find the patients where they are, I think that could be a strategy to really get over some of these issues, because right now it's almost backwards, right? Like you choose the sites where the trials are going to be, and then you try to find the patients at those sites. But what if those patients aren't there? And so I think through some of the things, obviously, that, Max, the infrastructure you've built in Europe, and Lisa here in the US, and, we're going to be doing some work to try to kind of have more of a national network database for ARPKD as well. Because I think if then up front you can know who the patients are that would be eligible for a certain trial, then you could target those sites. And if you do some of the things we talked about with decentralizing some of the trial procedures, then you can essentially try to take the trial to the patient.
Sure. Well, that's beautiful. Kind of brought us for full circle there, back to some of those operational opportunities, but here to be able to target some of the specific patient populations that might make the most sense. So now we're going to shift gears in the meeting, and we're going to focus on the discussion now more on clinical outcome assessments and other tools to help assess what's important to ARPKD patients. To give us a landscape analysis, you've already heard from her some, but it's my pleasure to introduce one of our panelists here, Dr. Katherine Dell, who's a pediatric nephrologist and vice chair of research for the Pediatric Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, where she also sees patients at a number of their outpatient facilities. Of note, one of her focus areas for research is on the use of quantitative MRI as a biomarker in CKD, including the progression in ARPKD. So, Katherine, take it away.
Hello. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak with you today. My topic is landscape analysis of tools to evaluate what's important to ARPKD patients and, of course, their families. These are my disclosures. So I would actually argue that we already know what's important to ARPKD patients and their families because we heard it in the externally led ARPKD Voice of the Patient meeting already in August of last year. And the patients were quite impactful in conveying what their experience is living with this disease. And so the things that they identified, that you've identified as important, are new treatments that prevent kidney or liver disease progression, or delay time to kidney and or liver transplant, or avoid the need for dialysis. We need better treatments for symptoms such as antihypertensives. We need treatments that have as few side effects as possible. We need treatments that are easier to administer, especially for younger children. And of course, we need more clinical trials for those living with ARPKD. So what are the barriers to addressing these needs? Well, certainly this is a rare, primarily pediatric disease. There is significant variation in disease severity and the rates of progression for both the liver and the kidney disease. Kidney and or liver disease may impact metabolism or the overall risk profile of therapeutic agents. And finally, there's a lack of robust biomarkers to assess kidney and liver disease progression during the course of a clinical trial. That's going to be the focus of the rest of this talk. So what are the currently used biomarkers or endpoints for clinical trials? Well, the FDA-approved surrogate endpoints of kidney disease severity and or progression that have been used for drug approval are relatively limited. Of course, there is estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is a proxy for kidney function decline and has been used in multiple studies of chronic kidney diseases of various forms. There is proteinuria, which is used primarily for glomerular diseases, and ARPKD is not a glomerular disease. And then, of course, there is total kidney volume, along with estimated GFR, which has been very successfully used for ADPKD. So this slide actually shows what we know about GFR decline in patients with ARPKD. On the left slide is data that we generated through the Chronic Kidney Disease in Children study, which is a prospective longitudinal study of CKD in children that's now almost at its 20th year. And as this illustrates, the relative amount of change of GFR is relatively slow, but there's enormous variability. If you just look at a couple of these dots, colored dots, you can see examples of a patient who progressed relatively fast, and then patients who are really not showing much progression at all. Factors that we identified associated with faster progression included older age and study entry. This is not entirely surprising, since we know that during puberty, renal function decline tends to accelerate regardless of the cause of kidney disease, and a GFR of less than 45. Very similar data were found in the ARPKD natural history study that was also NIH funded. And as we could see, the mean eGFR slope, the rate of decline, is very similar to ours. And they actually also had patients out into their 40s and 50s. But again, the range was highly variable. So we did some modeling with our data and found that if eGFR decline alone is used as a primary endpoint, over 400 ARPKD patients would need to be enrolled in a 4-year clinical trial in order to detect a statistically significant difference between a treatment and placebo group. That's obviously prohibitive given how rare the disease is. So additional biomarkers are needed to identify patients who are at high risk for progression, because then the numbers of patients needed for a trial would be substantially lower. So what about total kidney volume? Well, this slide really summarizes about 15 years of work by a number of distinguished nephrology researchers, Dr. Chapman, Grantham, Irizabal, and also Dr. Ron Perrone. And this walks through the initial validation, longitudinal progression, which identified a particular threshold for kidney volume that was associated with faster progression. And then more recently, a very robust risk stratification, at which at any given age greater than 15, your height-corrected total kidney volume can be used to really identify your likelihood of progressing very fast, class 1A, versus likelihood of perhaps class 1A is slow progression, class 1E is more rapid progression. And these metrics have been used not only for studying pharmaceutical agents, but also in clinical practice to determine which patients may benefit from the existing FDA-approved medication. Well, what about total kidney volume in ARPKD? Well, unfortunately, in this disease, kidney size actually stabilizes or decreases over time. Kidney size does not correlate with GFR decline, as the natural history study found. More recent data from the ARPKD group registry suggests that height-corrected TKV assessed by ultrasound may be useful as a biomarker to identify very young ARPKD patients. This is less than 2 years of age at high risk for rapid kidney function decline. However, there are certainly patients who present initially at an older age, so that would be less helpful for that population. So over the last decade or so, our group, including my collaborator, long-term collaborator, Dr. Chris Flask, and I have been working to try to develop alternative MRI biomarkers to assess kidney disease, ARPKD kidney disease severity, as well as progression. We actually started with two rodent models, a mouse and a rat, and over the last 4 years have extended those observations to human patients. And this slide just illustrates some of our work. So this is quantitative MRI, and it's actually obtained using a novel methodology developed at our university, which is motion-resistant, highly reproducible, rapid, and may eliminate the need for sedation, which is very important for studies in young kids. This illustrates the T1 and T2, T1, T2 of a healthy volunteer and an ARPKD subject, as well as the very robust reproducibility on 2 sequential days. This slide actually shows our newer work in which we included not only T1, T2 mapping, but also renal perfusion assessed by arteriospin labeling. And as we can see, we have very nice distinguishing of early CKD, which we defined as patients with a normal GFR, those with mild to moderate CKD, and the healthy volunteers. In terms of liver disease, the FDA-approved surrogate endpoints are equally limited. Liver biopsy is certainly invasive, and various laboratory tests have been used in some agents, not the types of diseases that ARPKD, congenital hepatic fibrosis, is aligned with. In terms of the biopsies, there's very limited liver biopsy data. Notably, hepatocellular damage is often absent, and the typical indications for liver transplant in ARPKD are actually advanced portal hypertension with recurrent bleeding or recurrent cholangitis, which is a bile duct infection, not the classic cirrhosis that you see in adults. Similarly, the various biochemical markers really do not show abnormalities until the disease is very advanced. This is some elegant work by Erum Hartung, who spoke to you at the previous meeting, basically illustrating that particularly the left lobe of the liver is stiffer using ultrasound elastography in patients with portal hypertension without versus those without. So in summary, ARPKD patients and families want safe and effective treatments for both the symptoms associated with ARPKD, such as hypertension, as well as the underlying kidney and liver disease, with the overall goal of slowing disease progression. Currently available FDA accepted surrogate biomarkers of kidney and liver disease progression have significant limitations specifically for ARPKD, which has stymied progress towards clinical trials. However, in combination with other biomarkers, specifically novel imaging methods under study, there's a potential to be able to move clinical trials forward, which is our ultimate goal. So I thank you, and I will send you back to the studio with James. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katherine, for that nice landscape analysis. And now I'm looking forward to our second panel discussion, our same panelists as before that we'll be welcoming back. But I also like for all of you in the audience to know that if you have questions you'd like to contribute to the conversation, you can go ahead and submit those in the comment form that's under the live player on the webpage today. And again, if time permitting, we'll try to work those into our conversation with our KOL panel. So at this point, I'd like to welcome our panel back and start out here with maybe a little bit of a follow-up from something that was raised by a number of you as a one of the top takeaways from the EL-PFDD meeting, which was really how much high blood pressure and GI issues were, rated as top-rated symptoms, right up there with, the progression of liver and kidney disease. And so, since we're talking about, assessment tools and other tools to, use in clinical trials, maybe I'll start by throwing it out there. Do we have the right tools to evaluate these, kind of more symptomatic components of the condition? And are there other considerations even outside of the direct assessment tools, that we need to consider in approaching, these, two kind of symptoms? And maybe there's others that would come to mind as well, other symptoms beyond those two. Those are just two that you all reflected on earlier. Maybe Max, I can have you kick us off in this second discussion we have this afternoon. What you're thinking around, assessing some of these more symptoms, and do we have the tools that we need?
Right. I guess for some of them we do have the tools. I love the idea that Lisa brought up. The idea of a potential trial on hypertension. I agree that getting good data on blood pressure, especially in young children, does require a lot of expertise. But it is surely a tool that experienced centers can apply, and the experience is there, and it is an issue that affects so many of the ARPKD children and families. For vomiting or GI issues, I would have to admit that I'm not fully aware of validated tools that would be out there. Maybe others know more about this. I would expect there are some tools, but personally, I have to admit that I'm not an expert in this.
No. Well, and thank you for reflecting on that, Max, and getting us started on that. Erum, maybe we can bring you into this conversation again, whether it doesn't have to be about specifically high blood pressure or specifically GI, but are there opportunities that you see to address those, and do we have the tools that we need to?
Yeah, I think on the GI front, I think this is probably an area where patient-reported outcomes are going to be extremely important. And I know that there's some validated, like the PROMIS measures, for example, there are instruments that include things like nausea and vomiting and those kinds of things. So I think that would be a really important area to talk about for GI symptoms. For hypertension, actually, I think one of the parents, if I recall correctly, on the PFDD meeting said that someone needs to invent better machines to check blood pressures on infants, and I 100% agree. So I don't know if there's any device developers on the call today, but I think, trying, as Katherine mentioned, taking a blood pressure on a 2-year-old or a 6-month-old or whatever it is a huge challenge. And I think not just for ARPKD, but for any pediatric kidney disease, I think if we really want to be able to do good research, we also need better ways to measure our really important but measurable endpoint, but it's a challenging one to measure.
Yeah, well, and I think that's very astute, and it kind of raises the question for me then of, are any of those like PROMIS, those NIH developed, PROMIS instruments, or any techniques for assessing blood pressure in the infants or youngest children, employed in any of the registry studies or clinical trials that are being conducted in ARPKD to date? Do we have any kind of hands-on experience yet, or would this be kind of a new novel approach? Lisa, maybe I'll pick on you to start here. I know you at the end of our last session talked about how this could be a major focus. So would love for you to reflect on it.
So, I think that this conversation is about tool development. Completely agree with what Erum said. We know it's a problem. We get cardiac echoes of these children, and we say, "Oh, it is a problem." But sort of day-to-day management requires monitoring. I would. So I think that understanding the sort of the landscape from the perspective of these automated blood pressure companies, is there any R&D interest? Because blood pressure in little children who have kidney disease is not an uncommon problem. So it would be hard for them to bite on ARPKD specifically. But if ARPKD could lead and say, we have a whole group of patients with a variety of kidney-related disorders behind us and cardiac disorders, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the issue of sort of vomiting, I think Max's group had a very important report about the openness of investigators with these children with huge bellies to having a G-tube placed. And I was I must say I was a little surprised by the results of that survey. Again, not in the US. I don't know if it would be the same here, but these are the kinds of questions that we should begin to start asking. I will tell you here at CHOP, the surgeons have this really cool center that is really the ultimate driver is patient-reported outcomes. It's called CORES. And one of the things that they're looking at is for children who need G-tubes for a variety of reasons, sometimes the indication is vomiting, how they do. And thinking about, how these kids are managed. Not all kids with ARPKD get G-tubes. Some of them do. Some of them get the classic G-tube, which is the tube that's put in to the stomach. Others, particularly those who have had vomiting issues, in my experience, some of these kids have been managed by the surgeons with much longer tubes that go well into to the intestine. And the Journal of Anecdotal Medicine says those kids do better. Well, maybe we should pick up on that if this is a major issue for these kids in thinking about working with our surgical colleagues to have and our GI colleagues, a combination of motility drugs, recognizing how these drugs are metabolized. We have to think about that. But motility drugs and where we place G tubes for these kids to get the calories they need. Because some of the vomiting issue is that we are trying to get these children to grow. So it becomes a cyclical problem. So I think, asking the question saying, yes, it's a rare disease, but there is this whole group of other rare diseases that hypertension is a problem. Can we think about device refinement for those little kids? Thinking about multidisciplinary approaches with our surgical and GI colleagues to think about clinical trials for these kiddos. And in some of the centers that are represented here, these are big centers, proof of concept, or a couple of centers getting together to have a demonstration that there might be a signal of improvement here, I think is important. And that, for me, having really taken some time to digest the August meeting, was to sort of say, as I said before, while cure is on everybody's mind, between here and cure, what are we going to do? And I'm thinking about Colleen's statement. My son is 24 years old. He's had more than one kidney liver transplant. Things are not a whole lot better over the 24-year span of his life.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to step back and think about these interval kinds of steps that would be amenable for study.
Yeah.
The final thing that I will say, James, that I know Matt knows, but maybe the audience doesn't know quite as well. Medicine has a lot of variability in terms of collegiality. And in terms of cystic disease in children, it is a remarkably collegial group across the world. All of us are now involved in a thought essay that we're putting together. And people have been so gracious with their thinking and their time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that using that collegiality to push for some of these kinds of, whether it's refinement of devices or new trials to think about symptomatically, could get some traction, some real traction.
Yeah, well, thank you for those reflections, Lisa, and I think it gives us a nice roadmap of opportunities, which is what today is really all about, is setting forward, we're not going to answer all of these questions today, but, how do we start down the right path? So, Katherine, obviously you shared a lot of your thoughts in your presentation, but, as we're talking about, kind of more, some of the less hard outcomes that we heard about at the PFDD, what are your thoughts on tools that we have and opportunities to, help, address those perhaps in clinical trials?
So I think one thing to think about is sort of how is ARPKD different than other forms of pediatric chronic kidney disease? Because there's a lot of similarity. So things like symptoms associated with declining renal function. And as I mentioned, the chronic kidney disease in children's study run by Sue Firth and Brad Werdy for years, involves 50 sites in the country. There are quality of life measures done as part of that. So we certainly have had a lot of publications. They've had a lot of publications about quality of life for CKD in general. Erum and I had done some work with the neurocognitive information on ARPKD and growth in ARPKD. So even though it's a bigger cohort, because it's well phenotyped, we were able to draw a lot of information. And I think as Max's registry develops, as Lisa's continues to develop, being able to pull that information and ask the right questions will then help us not only figure out, well, what's important to families and what might we be able to impact on, but how are we going to measure it? And if we already have some sort of preliminary data from some of these registries and prospective observational studies, that's going to go a long way to really being able to say, okay, now we've decided to do X, and say a medicine for the vomiting or some sort of standardized approach to high blood pressure management, to be able to then say, how are we going to assess the impact of that on the patient and the family? I think leveraging some of these bigger studies and the registries will go a long way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, funny enough, it relates to a question we got in from the audience here. We heard from a researcher, Ron, out of Boston, Massachusetts, who was asked a question about, registries. His question specifically is, should the PKD Foundation establish a patient-powered registry similar to what was done for ADPKD? And he goes on to say this will, could allow patients and families to self-identify and bring in some of those who may not already be connected with the expert academic centers. So Matt, maybe, the question is, should the foundation do this? So maybe I'll pitch this to you to start us out on.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question, Ron. I really appreciate Lisa's feelings on this. She's running her fantastic database right now, and I'd like to understand more about how you see the foundation working with you in the future. I mean, some things that come to mind, just to frame the discussion a bit, could be partnerships on AI, TKV imaging, and things like that, and ultimately genomics and future iterations. Our current ADPKD registry is focused on an EMR linkage, just for everyone's familiarity. But Lisa?
Sure. So I think that there are numbers of points of partnership. I think that what is very important is, you can slice and dice it in a lot of different ways. It is important to have the source of truth captured for the key clinical biologic parameters. So patient-reported outcomes about things like blood pressure and eGFR may not be quite as good, but none of our registries capture as well as a true, sort of patient-reported approach, the things about the burden of living with this disease. So there's the possibility of complementarity, number one. Number two, there are numbers of learning health networks in both the adult space and fewer in the pediatric space. But one of them actually was developed a number of years ago here at CHOP, and it's called PedsNet. And it involves now about 10 different centers around the country. And it really is an ETL, an extract, transform, load from the EHR of all the patients. And then you can slice and dice it about your patient your patient group of interest. That is something that there have been discussions about, could we leverage that for some rare diseases of the kidney? One of Erum and my colleagues here is doing that for glomerular disease. So that sort of, using the EHR to kind of automate things in terms of getting the source of truth from the EHR is important as well. And I think that the sort of the final comment that I'd make, and I'd love to hear other folks' perspective, is that we have to walk before we run. Applying AI to do fancy calculations when not all centers, for example, for imaging studies, at least in the United States, report in exactly the same way. It's not standardized. So we're applying AI to then a very noisy data set. Maybe the emphasis should be on trying to capture as big a cohort as possible of patients with this disorder. Again, the first principle, little less sexy question of how do these patients distribute in subgroups with this disease, and that might be a very important accomplishment. So I love the idea of partnerships. I don't think any one database effort can be sort of the sole source of truth. I think that I wouldn't want to switch out things that are based in the EHR for the patient reported. I love the conjunction and instead of or. Why not do both? And so partnerships with the foundation in that regard, partnerships with the foundation in terms of thinking about some of these learning health networks like PedsNet. How can we follow what's been done in glomerular disease? These are, I think, are really important questions.
Thank you
and
so
I know
much,
Erum
Lisa.
thought a lot about this.
Absolutely, and I look forward to further discussions with you on it. Sorry, Dr. Dell?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Lisa said. So I think one thing we could also do is take some cues from our oncology colleagues. So I've had some really interesting conversations recently about how they've taken rare diseases, taken various registries in different countries, and actually harmonized them, which Max and Lisa sort of have already done, but and actually convened a group to say, what are the key things we have to capture? What can be pulled directly from an EMR, and not necessarily everyone having to be on the same EMR, but how can these data elements be pulled? Because one of the challenges with rare disease stuff is oftentimes there isn't lots of funding, so you're manually entering stuff, and it requires the home peds nephrologist to be engaged. And I know Lisa has had this challenge with some of our colleagues. And so I think using that kind of tool set that's already in place very robustly in the pediatric oncology space by various organizations would really be something that I would put the foundation on the spot and say, that is the kind of thing that would be very, very helpful for it to be foundation-led.
Yeah, and if I could just, I think you're absolutely right. COG is the Children's Oncology Group that has done amazing work, including in very rare pediatric cancers. But if I could, though, I because of conversations I've had with Erum, I know she's thought deeply about going beyond, some of the things that are the sort of the more classic ways that we've developed databases. And I think we'd benefit from hearing her thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I think as Lisa mentioned, PedsNet, which is it harmonizes electronic health records across 11 different sites. So it actually includes data from over 13 million children across the United States. And so I'm actually working with that team now to try to get grant funding through the FDA actually to try to develop what's called a computable phenotype for ARPKD in PedsNet, so that we'd be able to essentially extract the data for the patients with ARPKD. And based on our estimates, we think there's going to be at least 500 or 600 children with ARPKD in the PedsNet database, which I think we might still not catch up with you, Max, but I think for a United States effort, I think that would be pretty monumental. And I think some of these questions that we have, like say the rate of GFR decline, like as Katherine alluded to, in that study that we had done in the CKID group, where we had beautiful GFR data, but only 22 children. So of course you get this huge variability, and then you come up with this, calculation, as Katherine did, that you would need 400 children in a clinical trial to see differences in eGFR decline. But if we were really able to get robust GFR decline data on a really large number of children, and then potentially identify subgroups that, okay, children with this characteristics, actually their GFR decline is this much, and there's much less variability, then in terms of the number that you would need to enroll in a clinical trial to be able to see a difference, that's going to be an order of magnitude less. And so I think really being able to get data on more kids, better defined subgroups, I think that will really be the key to being able to effectively do clinical trials.
Great. Well, thank you all for jumping in on that, and thank you, Ron, for that question. It's great to talk about some very specific but maybe practical ideas, as this whole discussion is about tools that we can leverage. So I do want to try to tackle quickly one more topic before we need to wrap things up here for our session today. And this focuses on the other two, top treatment goals that we heard from the EL-PFDD meeting. Patients stated that prevention of kidney or liver progression were their top two goals for future treatments. This in the morning session at the PFD were also two of the top, self-described burdens of these conditions. And so, Dr. Dell, in your presentation, you talked about some tools that we might have to, capture progression. But given, the potential of some of these tools, I would like for this panel to reflect on, what do we actually, hope or would want to achieve, whether it's on some of those, biomarkers or maybe even existing, clinical outcome assessments of organ failure, what is the minimum benefit that we're talking about, that would, in your minds, address what patients were asking for when they're asking for something that might help with the progression of their disease? Maybe on this one, Erum, we can start with you.
Sorry, can you restate the question?
Yes. So I'll try to boil it down a little bit more simply. Our participants at the EL-PFDD, they said, we want help with progression of kidney and liver disease, kind of progression being the key word of what they shared. And so, as we think about progression, that might be a slowing, so that's a slope that's being adjusted. It could be stopping progression. And of course, there can be improvements. Given the tools that we have, biomarkers and otherwise, how do you think about, a treatment benefit that would be clinically meaningful? What would you want to see, and on what markers?
Yeah, I mean, I think for patients, obviously, kind of being able to delay kidney failure or the potential need for kidney or liver transplant, I think that is huge. But I think also just thinking about how patients feel as they're going through that, like, the other main symptom that we didn't really talk about much today, but was talked about a lot during the meeting, was fatigue. And both the kidney and the liver involvement make people feel incredibly tired and miserable. And so, so if we did have, if a treatment maybe slows the GFR decline a little bit, but then also helps fatigue a lot, like maybe that's something worth pursuing. Conversely, if it's something that slows people's GFR decline but makes them feel terrible, then people aren't going to want to take it. So I think it's got to be a combination of things like being able to delay some of those hard outcomes, but then also really thinking about how the medications might make people feel.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that and kind of thinking about like the hybrid outcomes in a sense. Max, would love to get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I agree with what Erum said. I think for kidney, we've heard about the slope in the smaller cohort. I can say that the slope in our registry pretty much fits to the data that was found in that smaller cohort. So slope's one thing, and especially slope after the first year of life, maybe. Thinking about the young kids is a different story, and especially about kidney survival or progression to kidney failure in the first year of life. So I think this is a very hard endpoint for a clinical trial, and defining the subgroup that would enter a clinical trial with the endpoint of kidney failure, that would be a key step in my mind. So finding this high risk or this group of patients at high risk of very early kidney failure that could have the greatest benefit from a potential pharmacological intervention. I think that would be a group that could have benefits, and then obviously the benefit would be longer time to kidney failure, or maybe even avoid kidney failure. But even if you just could make it through that first year of life and get to that stage where you would have the weight for a kidney transplant, that would be a huge step ahead.
Absolutely. So we're hearing more again of the different subgroups and different kind of targets for them. And in this case, that most severe and rapid progressing young subgroup is essentially a very enriched population for some of these organ failure endpoints. Any other thoughts, either Lisa or Katherine, before we have to wrap up here?
Would just remind us all about the journey. So I was part of the CRISP study for a very long time in ADPKD. And it was a journey. It was a long journey. We learned in that journey that not just should we have talked to patients about clinical trials in the early days, we should talk to the FDA about clinical trials. And so we've learned those lessons. And I would reflect on where we are in 2024. Katherine showed the beautiful data that Maria Erasabal put together for the Mayo classification, and that largely comes from the CRISP data. And what Maria was able to show is that if you have class D, 1D or 1E, you are on a hot path to kidney failure. And that's who we target tolvaptan for. Tolvaptan is not for every patient with ADPKD. And so I think that this subset idea and the kids that have the sort of the most aggressive disease right now is a very reasonable target, in part because we understand from common PKD, what therapeutic agents we might be able to target for them. The other kids, it's going to take more knowledge. It's going to take more work by folks like Katherine and Erum about biomarkers so that we understand disease course. But I would reflect to say that there isn't one therapy. There isn't one group of ARPKD. So let's understand the group of ARPKD and the logical therapeutic interventions that we might have in these different groups. And it's kind of like building a house. The foundational studies are maybe with the kids that are the youngest with the most aggressive kidney disease, and we just sort of build it up in a complex way. That's how CF has been so successful. And now there are 60-year-old CF patients. And it didn't start with a drug. It started with optimizing their clinical care. So some of these morbidities are really important for life altering effects.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. And Katherine, we'll give you the final word here as we wrap up our panel discussion.
I think I would like to hark back to a term that I've heard from families and has already been said here, which is hope. And I think it's absolutely true that from a clinical trial planning standpoint, targeting a rapid risk of progression, et cetera, we didn't even discuss potentially how do we define that in the liver population, because I think we need to do that too. But I also would not want to wait 15 years, which is, I think, what it took CRISP to actually get all the way from the very first MRI to when it was actually this, robust clinical predictive model to be able to think about how we might be able to incorporate children who are not the absolute worst progressors, but are also not the children who are just totally doing nothing. And so in terms of progression, which is a small number, but maybe there's a way to target those ones that are progressing, a little bit faster, or maybe we target them as they go into puberty when we know that the line may do this, in which case we're more likely to see them have that endpoint than if we start treating them when they're 5 and we expect a change in 5 years. So I think it's an and Lisa had said the word and. It's an and in terms of capturing the hard endpoints, but also the softer endpoints. Remember, for tolvaptan in ADPKD, there was eventually a GFR change that was shown, but the pain improved very rapidly. Yeah. And that's a huge plus. That also helps people want to stay on drug, right? Yeah. Or stay in a trial because they're perceiving a benefit. So it's an and it's the hard and the soft endpoints, but it's what matters to the patients. And so I think that's ultimately tried to give them hope. They want trials, they want to participate, and we just need to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. Well, just an incredible thanks to all 4 of you for being so thoughtful, listening to so many testimonies of, what people are going through and living with ARPKD. Clearly, you all, spend, are the experts and spend so much of your careers and time thinking about these issues, but to welcome in this wealth of additional learning and knowledge from the patient community and spending time with us today to, reflect on that. And, obviously we didn't set out to answer all of the questions, but I think we were successful at starting to chart a path forward on a lot of these different issues. So at this stage, I'd like to turn it back over to Matt to close us out. Matt?
Thank you all for an incredible afternoon of rich discussion on the future direction and priorities for ARPKD research and patient-centered therapeutic developments. Today's program will be available for on-demand viewing on the PKDF website. And I'd like to thank our panelists for taking part in this discussion, Drs. Lisa Guay-Woodford, Katherine Dell, Erum Hartung, and Max Liebau. I'd also like to thank our partners in planning and facilitating this meeting, Larry Bauer and James Valentine. Also, thank you to the FDA for allowing us to hold this adjunct scientific meeting. We are extremely grateful to everyone who participated today and in August for a patient-focused meeting. Thank you to the Dudley Digital Works media team for the production planning and all the behind-the-scenes work they've done today. I'd also like to thank the PKD Outcomes Consortium and the Critical Path Institute for their support of this meeting and continued work towards ending PKD. Finally, a huge thanks goes to you, our ARPKD research community, demonstrating a dedication to fulfilling the unmet needs of everyone impacted by ARPKD. Today's meeting will have a lasting impact on the future of ARPKD research and therapy development. So once again, to the entire community, thank you for making your voices heard today.